Hey, this is Mike with Top Water Kings. We're going to talk about stages of pre-spawn, spawn, and post-spawn, and how bass act, and kind of key signs that you can tune into to figure out whether you think the bass in the fishery you're fishing are getting close to get on bed, or whether you think they're on bed or they could be already coming off. So stay tuned for that. In the early spring, before the water warms up, the bass stay deep. They'll stay in the deeper water, and about the time the water warms up into the shallows, they'll come up and they'll do what they call staging. And they'll actually find their beds, and they'll move into shallows and start foraging for food in that area. Kind of look at where they're going to set their beds up. And once they found their mate, they actually go ahead and create beds. They'll take their tail and they'll fan beds out and kind of just make circular beds. Generally, from what I understand, 12 to 24 inches, depending on the size of the fish. And once they get it on, basically the female and the male will both defend the bed. A lot of times the male will run back and forth as the female sits directly over the bed, defending the bed, watching out for predators that come in and eat the eggs. And once the yearlings hatch out, she basically goes into post-spawn. And in post-spawn, she'll move to kind of deeper waters, maybe to subpoints, and feed and forage, getting ready for the fall turnover, in which in fall turnover, they go into a feeding binge. They actually get the schooling real heavy and they'll start feeding. Basically collect that energy that they used up in the time that they were on beds, trying to give birth to their young. And they just stage off in the spring and get ready for the winter, in which in the winter time they'll move back down to the same deep water they was in the summer, trying to evade the heat in the summer, and now they're trying to evade the cold. They'll move down in the deeper water. That's the full cycle from spring to winter.
So how can you tell, like everybody wants to get out there when it's pre-spawn and spawn, how can you tell when it's pre-spawn, like when it's starting?
You'll be able to notice that the fish move into shallow waters. Where you were catching them anywhere from 15, 20, 25 foot of water, they'll now move up to 5 to 10 foot of water. You'll start catching them more shallow. And one way you can tell it's right at the border between pre-spawn and spawn is you'll see sores on their tail. That's a key indicator that they're making beds. Anytime you see the sores on the bottom of their fin, you'll know that they're making beds.
The red sores?
Yeah, that means they're getting ready. About the time you start seeing those sores means that time that they're fanning beds, they're getting ready, getting their beds ready. Post-spawn is pretty simple. Once you've located the fish on their beds in the bedding process, in post-spawn the fish, you'll come to those beds and those fish will be gone, and it'll kind of be a key indicator that their yearlings have hatched out, and now the baby bass have moved on and the mama's moved off the bed. As soon as she moves off that bed is when you'll start finding them deeper. They'll start staging towards deeper water as it gets cooler through the fall until winter, when they get deep again. In wintertime they'll hold deep.
So when you start pulling them in and you notice they got the sores on them, how deep do you need to be fishing?
It ain't so much a matter of depth. Every lake's going to vary. It's more about locating the beds. You need to find shallow water and kind of look through it and see if you can't use some kind of special sunglasses or something to see a little deeper. You need to be able to locate their beds. You'll see them. It'll look like just a big white circle down on the bottom of the lake bed. Usually they'll bed. Some of them bed a little deeper. Some of them bed shallow. So it's more about just once you find one with a sore on its tail, I'd just start looking for beds. That's what my next move would be, just to start looking. You'll find them all the way up to 6-7 inches of water. Some of them bed so shallow their back will be almost out of the water.
So if a fish is on bed what's the best way to get it to actually go after what you're fishing with?
The best tactic is to intimidate it. If you throw in over and she's not, her or the male aren't hungry and they won't eat, which they typically don't, there are certain times of the day they will. You can throw something like a jig or a worm and let it sink into their bed, and they may not hit it the initial first time, but if you keep pitching that same lure into their bed over and over and over, she'll eventually become aggravated, and she'll try to eat your lure out of aggravation. It's not out of hunger, it's out of sheer aggravation. She's trying to get rid of your lure.
Yeah.
Before it eats her young. That's her idea, because you know lots of things, mainly lizards, salamanders and stuff, they'll get down in the water. They'll get down in the water and eat those bass eggs. That's why a lizard is the #1 fishing lure or fishing tool when it comes to bedding bass. Lizard is the #1 go-to lure.
So the pre-spawn is when they're making the beds and you can see the sores on them, and you know to go shallow and look for beds.
Right.
During spawn is when they're actually staying on the beds.
Right, they're sitting on it and protecting it. That's typically your about April to May. Post spawn is their newborns have hatched and fleed, and now they are just pretty much burning off energy in the summer is what's going on. They don't have a lot of energy to burn, so a lot of times in the summertime, that's why they'll hit bigger baits. They just come off their bed, they're kind of weak. They need to build themselves back up. And that's what they do during the summertime. They basically, they find ways to store and burn energy in the summer, and then in the fall, when it cools down, is when they really become active. They say that the #1 active temperature for a bass would be about 65 degrees. That's their favorite temperature, most active.
And that's degrees outside or degrees in the water?
Water temperature, not ambient temperature. So basically, right now our water temp shows 88.6 on my Lowrance, which is about 20 degrees too high from the comfort of a bass. That's surface temp.
So they're going to stay in the shade in the bottoms.
They're going to be in the shade or down deep in the grass, depending on what kind of lake it is. In our situation on this lake, there's a lot of overhang. That's why we keep catching them right at the break, where you find shade overhanging in the water. I imagine in the shade it's maybe 2 to 3 degrees cooler, probably. Gives them a place to kind of get a break from it. A lot of people in the summertime like to flip underneath overhangs and underneath docks. Dock fishing is very popular this time of the year. Those bass will kind of school up in there after they come off their beds, and they'll school in the summertime, and basically you can just find them stocked up under docks.
So at what point when they're going from post-spawn into the winter, how are you fishing that time?
At that point, this is what they call fall turnover. When the upper and lower levels of lake temperature kind of collide.
Right.
And when that happens, the fish just go crazy. They actually go deep and shallow, and they go into feeding binges. So it's really more about, you can almost use anything at that point in time. You could use any of your plastics, any of your crankbaits, spinner baits, hot waters.
And what months is that usually?
That usually happens about August and September. About the time that it's cooling down.
So we're kind of in a midpoint, kind of a lull right now.
We're at a point right now where the heat index is beating on the top of the lake, and it's pushing the fish into pockets and down deep.